At some point, you started referring to what happened to you as the thing that made you who you are. Maybe you said it directly, in conversation, when someone asked about a formative period or a difficult relationship or a stretch of years that looked from the outside like damage. Maybe you said it more quietly to yourself as a kind of accounting, a way of justifying the cost. The logic is persuasive on its face. You went through something and now you are the person who went through it, and that person is more complex, more serious, more capable of understanding what others cannot, because you have earned that understanding through pain. The suffering was tuition, and you have been collecting on the credential ever since. There is something real in this. There is also something that is not wisdom at all, something that has been wearing wisdom's face for so long you may have stopped checking. Start with what pain actually does mechanically, before assigning it any meaning. Significant suffering, the kind that reorganizes you, that leaves marks you can still locate years later, produces two things reliably. The first is heightened sensitivity. You become attuned to certain registers of experience that other people move through without noticing. You recognize patterns in behavior, in conversations, in the subtle arrangements of power or neglect that operate below the threshold of most people's attention. This is real. It is not nothing. There are things you can see that others cannot, because you learn to watch for them in conditions where missing them cost you something. The second thing suffering produces is pattern recognition that outpaces its own evidence. You learn something under duress, and the learning was correct in its original context, and now the pattern fires whether or not the context has changed. You read danger in neutral situations. You read abandonment in ordinary withdrawal. You read contempt in ambiguity. The sensitivity that was once calibration has become, in some domains, overfit. A model trained too specifically on one kind of data, generalizing too aggressively to new situations that only superficially resemble the original. This is not a character flaw. It is what trauma does, what prolonged stress does, what early injury does to a developing nervous system trying to make sense of an unpredictable environment. The psyche learns. The problem is that what it learns is often not what you think it learned, and here is the specific thing that does not get said often enough. Neither of those two outcomes, heightened sensitivity, hyperactive pattern recognition, is wisdom. They are the raw material of wisdom in roughly the same way that strong intuitions are the raw material of understanding. The material requires something else before it becomes the thing. That something else is examination. What stops the examination, and this is worth sitting with before moving past it, is that the two things pain produces feel like wisdom from the inside. The sensitivity feels like depth. The pattern recognition feels like intuition. The person who has been through something serious inhabits a relationship to experience that is genuinely different from those who have not. And that difference registers internally as a kind of knowing, as earned understanding. The problem is that earned understanding and accurate understanding are not the same thing. The sensitivity can be real and still be miscalibrated. The intuition can be quick and still be wrong. And the person who has conflated these two kinds of knowing, the felt sense of depth with actual clarity, is in a position that is very difficult to examine from the inside, precisely because the conflation feels like the examination has already been done. Viktor Frankl's central argument was not about suffering. It is consistently misread as being about suffering, because the biographical context, Auschwitz, the systematic destruction of everything external that gives life its ordinary scaffolding, is so extreme that it tends to dominate the reading of everything he wrote. But his argument was about meaning, and the difference is not semantic. Suffering, for Frankl, was not itself productive. It was not valuable. He was explicit about this. Suffering that had no meaning attached to it was simply destructive. It ground people down. It broke them. It killed them. What transformed suffering into something survivable, and eventually into something that could be integrated into a livable life, was the act of choosing a relationship to it, deciding what it meant, choosing what you were going to orient yourself toward in the context of it. The person who has been through significant pain and concludes that the pain itself made them wise has, in Frankl's terms, skipped the step. They have received the raw material and mistaken it for the finished thing. They have said, "This happened, therefore I am deeper." But what Frankl observed in the camps, and this is the detail that tends to get omitted, was that suffering did not uniformly produce nobility or depth or wisdom. It produced a range of responses, and some of them were very ugly. Some people became predatory. Some became desperate and small. Some found extraordinary interior resources, and some collapsed completely, and the suffering itself did not determine which outcome arrived. What determined it, to the extent that anything within a person's control determined it, was the question each person chose to ask about what they were experiencing. You think the pain taught you. In some ways it did. But pain is a teacher the way a fire is a teacher. It will absolutely teach you something. But what it teaches depends entirely on whether you examine the lesson or simply carry the burn. Jung had a clinical concept he called the wound as vocation, the idea that the specific nature of a person's injury tends to generate in psychologically healthy development a particular orientation toward that domain of experience. The person wounded in the domain of authority becomes, potentially, a nuanced student of power. The person wounded in the domain of love becomes, potentially, someone who understands love with a precision that the unwounded cannot access. The wound creates a concentrated attention. That concentrated attention can develop over time into genuine insight. What Jung also noticed, and this is the part of the formulation that almost never gets included when people cite it, is that the wound can equally produce its opposite. The person wounded in the domain of authority becomes a person obsessed with power, but unable to examine that obsession. The wound draws the attention, but the attention stays on the wound rather than moving through it. The difference between these two outcomes was not for Jung a matter of how serious the injury was. It was a matter of whether the person had engaged in what he called the process of individuation, the active, ongoing, uncomfortable work of bringing the contents of the unconscious into conscious awareness, of examining rather than simply experiencing, of making the implicit explicit. The wound that has not been examined is not inert. It does not sit quietly in the past, conferring depth on whoever carries it. It operates. It shapes your responses, your fears, your projections, your relationships, your characteristic defenses. It constructs the architecture of your daily experience without announcing itself. And the person who believes their wound has made them wise, who wears the scar as credential, is, in Jung's terms, often the person who has most thoroughly avoided the encounter with what the wound actually contains, because the encounter is not pleasant. What the wound contains is not only strength, it contains the specific beliefs you formed about yourself and the world in the moment of injury, beliefs that were almost certainly partially true and partially the distorted interpretation of a person in pain. It contains the adaptive strategies that protected you then and may be obstructing you now. It contains grief that may not have been fully moved through, rage that may have been redirected rather than examined, shame that may have been converted into pride rather than dissolved. The wound is not a simple thing, and carrying it as evidence of depth is one of the more elegant ways of never having to open it. There is a specific social dynamic that emerges from this, and it is worth naming precisely because it tends to go unnamed. The person who has organized their identity around their suffering becomes, over time, a particular kind of authority. They have standing in conversations about difficulty. They have a kind of gravitas that is hard to argue with because the experience is real, and questioning someone's relationship to their own pain tends to feel like cruelty. What this means in practice is that the suffering as credential tends to be self-immunizing. It cannot be challenged without appearing callous. It cannot be questioned without seeming to deny what was real. And this immunity makes it an extraordinarily stable identity structure, one that can persist for decades without being examined because the examination itself has been framed, consciously or not, as an attack. Nietzsche called a version of this ressentiment, and while his formulation is usually applied to class resentment and the moral systems that emerge from powerlessness, the underlying structure maps with uncomfortable precision onto the psychology of unexamined suffering. Ressentiment is the process by which powerlessness is converted into a moral position, by which the person who cannot act transforms their inability to act into evidence of their superior sensitivity, by which the wound becomes not just an experience, but a source of authority, a justification for a particular relationship to the world, a reason why the ordinary demands of growth and risk and engagement do not fully apply. The person in ressentiment is not dishonest exactly. They believe what they're saying, the suffering was real, the impact was real. What has happened is that the suffering has been recruited unconsciously, systematically, into the service of a particular self-image that does not require the person to continue developing. The pain becomes a reason to stay in place, not consciously, not cynically, but functionally. You are not broken by having done this, but you are not yet wise. Erich Fromm spent a significant portion of his intellectual life trying to understand why people choose unfreedom, why, given the opportunity for genuine autonomy, for genuine self-determination, a person will systematically choose the structures and identities that constrain them. His answer, in Escape from Freedom, was that genuine freedom is experienced as anxiety, and that most of the psychological structures people construct for themselves, conformism, authoritarianism, destructiveness, are ways of managing that anxiety by giving it a container, by becoming something definite, by belonging to something that has an identity, even if it costs you yours. What he did not explicitly develop, but what follows from his framework, is that a wound can function in exactly this way. The wound is a container. It is something definite to be. The person who has suffered significantly has been given by their suffering a story that organizes their experience, a before and an after, a cause and an effect, an explanation for why they are the way they are. That explanation is not wrong. But it is also extraordinarily convenient. In a specific sense, it is already written. It does not require continuous construction. It does not require the ongoing work of deciding who you are in the absence of the injury that shaped you. It does not require the terrifying experience of stepping out of the story the wound tells about you and asking what you would be without it. Fromm's necrophilous character, his most extreme formulation of the escape from freedom, was characterized by an attachment to what is fixed, dead, settled, rather than living, growing, open. It is a psychology in love with the past, not because the past was good, but because the past is finished. It cannot surprise you. It cannot demand anything further from you. The wound, for the person who has not examined it, has some of this quality. It is the most settled thing about them. It is the thing around which everything else has been organized. And organizing your identity around something fixed is, among other things, a way of stopping. Consider what the alternative actually requires, because it is worth being specific about this rather than gesturing at it. Examining the wound does not mean revisiting the original injury in exhaustive detail. That conflation between examination and re-traumatization is itself one of the ways the examination gets avoided. What it means, more precisely, is looking at what you came to believe as a result of what happened. Not just the narrative, not just the sequence of events, but the conclusions, the implicit premises, the working model of how the world operates and what you can expect from it and what you are allowed to want and what the cost of exposure typically is. These conclusions are usually partially correct. They were formed under real conditions in response to real things that happened. They are not delusions. What they are is incomplete, models built from a specific set of data points during a specific period, often by a version of you that was younger and less resourced than you are now, and applied forward into contexts that may differ in ways that the model does not register. The model says, closeness is dangerous. The model says, expecting things from people leads to being let down. The model says, your needs are too much, or your needs are invisible, or the only safe position is the one in which you need nothing at all. These premises, and they are premises, not facts, though they feel like facts, were constructed in conditions of genuine evidence. They are not irrational. They are, in many cases, the rational conclusions a person would draw from the experiences that generated them. What makes them worth examining is not that they were wrong then. It is that they may be wrong now in contexts that do not have the same structure as the one in which they were formed, applied by a person with more resources than the one who formed them, to situations that would respond differently if approached differently. The model runs in the background. It does not announce itself. It does not say, "I am a conclusion drawn from pain during a specific period of your development." It says, "This is just how things are. This is what I know about people. This is what I know about myself." And the person who has organized their identity around their suffering has, in a significant sense, agreed to live inside the model without asking whether the model still holds. Frankl's therapeutic practice was built on asking people to articulate what they were choosing to mean by their experience, not what had happened, that was not in question, but what orientation they were going to take toward it, what they were going to do with the space between what had occurred and who they were going to be in its aftermath. The meaning was not found, it was constructed. And the construction required the person to acknowledge that more than one construction was possible, that the suffering could be made to mean different things, and that the choice of meaning was genuinely a choice, even when it didn't feel like one. This is what the person who wears their suffering as credential has not yet done. They have accepted the first construction, the one that arrived in the immediate aftermath, the one that made the most intuitive sense given where they were, and treated it as fact rather than interpretation. They have stopped at the diagnosis and not moved into the treatment. The complication, the thing that makes this harder than simply deciding to examine your wound, is that the identity organized around suffering is often genuinely useful in the short term. It produces real things. It produces empathy, sometimes profound empathy, for others in pain. It produces a kind of seriousness about experience that shallower people genuinely lack. It produces art sometimes. It produces care work sometimes. The wound as vocation is real. What it also produces, and what tends to go unexamined, is a certain immunity to the demands of ordinary life, not consciously. But the person who has suffered significantly has standing to decline things. They have a reason, always available, for why this particular engagement is too much, for why this particular relationship requires different terms, for why the standard expectations of reciprocity or growth or risk do not quite apply in their specific case. The suffering is not being weaponized exactly, but it is being used, and what it is being used for is protection. Hannah Arendt, writing about something quite different, the nature of moral responsibility in conditions of systemic evil, made an observation that applies here in a way she would probably not have intended. She wrote about the importance of thinking, specifically about the danger of what she called thoughtlessness. Not stupidity, not cruelty, but the simple failure to stop and examine what you are doing and what it means. Her argument was that genuine evil, in its most mundane form, is not produced by monsters. It is produced by people who have stopped thinking, who have accepted a ready-made framework and applied it without continuing to interrogate it, who found in the available categories and narratives a way of understanding their situation that relieved them of the burden of continuous judgment. Arendt believed that thinking, actual thinking, the slow, effortful movement of attention toward what you believe and why, was not a luxury or an intellectual hobby. It was a moral obligation. The failure to think was, for her, an ethical failure, because it was what made otherwise ordinary people capable of going along with structures that, if examined, they would have found intolerable. The comfort of the ready-made framework, the narrative that explains your situation, defines your role, tells you what is expected and what is permissible, was, in her analysis, exactly the comfort you should be most suspicious of. The person who has organized their life around an unexamined wound is not committing anything like the moral failure Arendt was describing, But the structure she identified, the ready-made framework, the framework that does not require continuous interrogation, the one you can apply without the ongoing effort of thought, has the same psychological shape. You accepted a story about what you are. The story was not false. You stopped examining it, and now it operates as though it were settled, as though the interpretive work were done, as though who you became in the aftermath of your injury is the final word on who you are. It is not the final word. It is where you stopped asking. William James observed that the self is not a single thing, but a construction, assembled, maintained, and revised through ongoing social encounter, through the accumulating weight of habit, through the stories we tell about the continuity between who we were and who we are now. He saw selfhood as something more like a verb than a noun. You are not a fixed entity who had experiences. You are an ongoing process that includes those experiences as material, but is not determined by them. James was also among the first psychologists to take seriously the multiplicity of the self, the way a person maintains different selves in different relational contexts, the way the you that shows up in a professional setting and the you that shows up in intimate conversation and the you that inhabits the interior monologue of 2 in the morning are not quite the same entity. What he noticed is that the self that speaks most loudly in moments of crisis, in moments of pain, in moments of organizing emergency, tends to persist. It tends to colonize the other selves, the emergency self, the wounded self, the self forged in the specific conditions of survival. This self has a certain authority that is very difficult to dispute because its authority is backed by the weight of what it has been through. It has standing. It has evidence. It has earned its place. What James would say, and this is not warm, but it is honest, is that you are not required to remain that self. The construction can be revised, not falsified, not erased, not pretended away, but revised. The habit of returning to the wound as your most authoritative self-knowledge is a habit with the same plasticity and the same resistances as any other habit. The wound shaped you. You have been reshaping yourself in relation to the wound ever since, whether you named it as that or not. The question is whether you are doing it consciously or whether you have simply allowed the original shaping to continue propagating forward unchecked. What this means for the person addressed here is something specific and not entirely comfortable. The story that your suffering made you who you are is only true in the sense that it is the story you have chosen to tell, and it has the shape it has because of the choices you have been making continuously since the suffering occurred, about what to examine and what to leave intact. The wound shaped you, but you have also been shaping yourself in relation to the wound, deciding every day whether to approach it or avoid it, whether to open it to examination or to wear it as credential, whether to let it be a place where you stopped or a place from which you eventually continue. James would say that what you are is what you habitually do, and that the habit of carrying the wound without examining it is a practice, as real and as consequential as any other practice, which can be interrupted and replaced by a different practice, but only if you first acknowledge that it is a practice and not simply the truth of what happened. There is a question that sits beneath all of this, and it tends to be the question the examination eventually arrives at, and it is not a comfortable one. Who are you without it? Not without the experience. The experience is real and permanent, and nothing is asking you to pretend otherwise. But without the identity organized around it, without the suffering as credential, without the particular authority that comes from having been through something, without the standing to decline things, without the story that explains why you are the way you are, and why the usual expectations do not entirely apply. If you remove the wound as the organizing principle of your self-understanding, what would be left? What would you be responsible for that you are currently exempted from? What would you be expected to attempt that you are currently permitted to avoid? What would you owe to yourself, to others, that the wound has been quietly excusing you from? This is the question that the identity organized around suffering protects you from having to ask, because the answer may require becoming someone who is not defined by what happened. Someone who carries the experience, fully, honestly, without pretending it wasn't what it was, but who is not anchored by it. Someone for whom the injury is a fact of their history rather than the central fact of their identity. That is harder than it sounds, not because the wound was not serious, it may have been very serious, but because the self organized around a wound has, over time, become comfortable in a specific way, has arranged its relationships, its self-perceptions, its explanations, its exemptions around that organizing principle. Removing the principle does not leave you free. It leaves you with the work of finding out what you actually are when you are not being defined by what you have been through. Frankl wrote that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds a meaning, but he was careful, more careful than most of his readers, about what kind of meaning that could be. He was not saying that suffering is secretly good or that pain is a gift or any of the other formulations that get attributed to him in motivational contexts. He was saying that a human being can survive, and even sometimes flourish, in conditions of extreme suffering if they are able to maintain an orientation towards something beyond the suffering itself. Not the suffering redeemed, not the suffering explained, the suffering transcended, which means moved through, not converted into identity. The person who has made their wound into their identity has found a meaning for the suffering, but it is the most local meaning available. The wound means, this is who I am. The wound means, this is why I am this way. The wound means, this is what I am owed, what I am excused from, what I am authorized to demand from others. These meanings are real, they are not invented, but they are also the meanings that keep you most tightly in orbit around the injury, most continuously defined by it, least likely to move through it into territory that the injury has not already mapped. There is a version of you that exists past the point where the wound is the central organizing fact of your experience. That version still knows what happened. That version carries the history without being pinned by it. That version has done the examining, has asked, honestly, what you came to believe and whether those beliefs still serve, has grieved the parts that required grief and revised the parts that required revision, has stopped using the wound as an excuse and started asking what you would do with yourself if excuses were no longer available. That version is not who you have been. Whether it is who you become is not a question that pain can answer. The strange thing about this, the thing that makes it difficult to say clearly without sounding either harsh or falsely consoling, is that the suffering was not meaningless. That is not the argument being made here. What happened to you was real. The impact was real. The way it reorganized your nervous system, your expectations, your relationship to trust and safety and possibility. These are real. Nothing in this script is asking you to revise that downward, to treat what you went through as less than it was, to perform a kind of forced gratitude that papers over what actually happened. What is being asked is something more specific. It is whether you have ever actually asked what you came to believe in the specific, granular sense, as a result of what happened, not what you felt, not what you remember, but what you concluded. What permanent rules got written into the operating system in the aftermath of the injury, rules that have been running ever since, governing what you expect from people, from yourself, from the future, without announcing that they are rules rather than truths, because that examination is the thing that pain cannot do on its own. It cannot do it no matter how serious the suffering was, no matter how long you carried it, no matter how much it shaped the person you became. The examination is something you do or you do not do, and the suffering has nothing to say about which it will be. Pain has already given you everything it has. The sensitivity is yours. The pattern recognition is yours. The particular attunement to certain kinds of difficulty, that is yours. These are real things. They are not nothing. What they are not, and what they will never become on their own, is wisdom. Wisdom is what happens when you take those things and examine them, when you look at what the pain taught you and ask whether the lesson still holds, whether the model still fits, whether the self organized around the injury is the self you would choose to continue being if the wound were no longer the thing doing the organizing. That is a question pain cannot ask for you. It has been waiting patiently for you to ask it yourself.